Have you ever wondered why life sometimes feels like an uphill battle? Why, no matter how hard we try, certain challenges keep finding their way to us? The traffic jam that makes you late, the unexpected illness, the relationship that falls apart. Are these random misfortunes, cruel twists of fate, or something more profound? Buddhism offers an ancient and profound lens to explore these questions. At the heart of this perspective is the concept of karma, a word that often gets misunderstood or oversimplified. Karma isn't just about what goes around comes around, nor is it a cosmic punishment system doling out rewards and punishments arbitrarily. Instead, it's a deeply nuanced principle of cause and effect, a spiritual law woven into the very fabric of existence. Imagine karma as a vast, invisible web of actions and consequences, stretching across time and space, connecting every thought, word, and deed to the experiences we encounter. This web is dynamic, not rigid. It responds, shifts, and evolves with our intentions and awareness. Karma isn't destiny carved in stone. It's a living process that invites us to understand, grow, and transform. But what about the obstacles? The difficulties that seem to block our path? Buddhism doesn't shy away from these. Rather, it acknowledges obstacles as an inevitable part of life, and crucially, as integral elements on the path to awakening. These challenges aren't punishments or random misfortune. They're reflections of past actions, yes, but also invitations, doors opening to deeper insight and liberation. This understanding changes everything. Obstacles become not enemies to fear or avoid, but teachers urging us to look more deeply, to cultivate patience, compassion, and wisdom. They reveal the subtle workings of karma in our lives, showing how every difficulty is tied to patterns of cause and effect stretching back beyond this moment. And here lies a liberating truth. While karma influences our experiences, it does not imprison us. We hold the power to reshape this invisible web through mindfulness, intention, and ethical living. The obstacles we face aren't walls but stepping stones, opportunities to rewrite the story of our lives. As we begin this exploration together, we will unravel what karma truly means, how it shapes obstacles in our lives, and most importantly, how Buddhism offers practical tools to transform these challenges into profound growth. Our journey isn't just about understanding. It's about awakening, learning to dance with karma rather than be bound by it. So, let's step beyond the surface and enter a deeper conversation about karma, obstacles, and the remarkable potential hidden within every difficulty. The path may be challenging, but it's also rich with wisdom waiting to be discovered. We often hear karma described as fate, a fixed destiny written in the stars, or worse, a system of cosmic punishment for our wrongdoings. But in truth, karma is far more subtle, complex, and ultimately empowering than these common misunderstandings suggest. At its core, karma is the natural law of cause and effect. Every action, every intention behind that action, plants a seed, a potential that will one day ripen into a result. But unlike a strict, mechanical chain of events, karma is not blind or unchanging. It is deeply tied to consciousness, to the quality of our awareness and choice. Imagine two people both facing the same hardship, say, losing a job. One sinks into despair, blaming the world and feeling utterly defeated. The other sees an opportunity to learn, adapt, and grow. The experience is the same, yet the karma unfolding is different because the mental states and intentions differ. Karma responds to our inner landscape as much as to outer actions. This means karma isn't destiny carved in stone. It's more like a flowing river, shaped by the terrain of our minds and hearts. While past actions set certain tendencies or conditions, the present moment always offers a fresh chance to steer the current differently. What about punishment then? Buddhism does not teach that karma is a system of divine retribution, like a judge handing down sentences. Instead, it's a mirror reflecting the natural consequences of actions aligned or misaligned with wisdom and compassion. If we plant harmful seeds through greed, hatred, or ignorance, we tend to harvest suffering. But if we plant seeds of kindness, generosity, and understanding, we open the door to happiness and freedom. Karma is deeply connected to intention, not just what we do, but why we do it. This is why a careless word born of frustration or anger can carry consequences far beyond its moment. Likewise, a small act of genuine kindness, even if unnoticed by others, can create ripples of healing and connection. It's also important to recognize that karma unfolds over time, sometimes immediately, sometimes over many lifetimes, according to Buddhist cosmology. This perspective helps explain why certain obstacles appear sudden and seemingly unfair. They may be ripening seeds from long ago, urging us to face what we have sown. Yet the power of karma lies precisely in this unfolding process. Because it's not fixed, we can transform it. Every moment offers a new opportunity to act with awareness, to cultivate positive intentions, and to break free from harmful patterns. This dynamic nature of karma invites us to step out of victimhood and into responsibility, not as a burden, but as a gateway to liberation. We are not trapped by the past. Instead, we become co-creators of our present and future through conscious choice. As we continue, we will explore how these karmic forces manifest as obstacles in our lives, not as random curses, but as meaningful challenges. And we'll uncover the ways Buddhism equips us to meet these challenges with courage, clarity, and compassion. Because understanding karma beyond fate and punishment is the first step toward reclaiming our power, the power to transform suffering into wisdom and obstacles into stepping stones. Life's challenges don't come out of nowhere. Within the Buddhist understanding, these obstacles are often the natural ripening of karma, the unfolding of seeds planted by our past actions, thoughts, and intentions. But how exactly does karma create obstacles? What forms do these challenges take, and how do they shape our experience? First, it's essential to realize that obstacles aren't just external events. They arise on multiple levels: physical, emotional, mental, and even social. A persistent illness, a difficult relationship, financial hardship, or inner turmoil like anxiety and fear can all be expressions of karmic influence. Sometimes the obstacles we face feel personal and isolated. Other times, they seem to echo a collective pattern affecting whole communities or societies. Karma operates through cause and effect, but the causes may be subtle and complex. For example, a moment of anger or harsh speech towards someone can create ripples that return in the form of conflict or alienation later. Or long-standing habits like greed or jealousy might manifest as continual dissatisfaction or struggle. These are the seeds maturing into obstacles, not as punishment, but as natural results that demand our attention. Take the story of a dedicated practitioner who, despite years of effort, faces recurring setbacks. Perhaps they experience loss, illness, or rejection. On the surface, it may seem unfair, but through the lens of karma, these are not random blows of fate. They are invitations, signals pointing to unresolved causes, unhealed wounds, or unconscious patterns that need transformation. Obstacles created by karma come in many shapes: physical obstacles, chronic health problems, accidents, or bodily limitations that challenge one's ability to live freely. Emotional and mental obstacles, fear, anxiety, depression, attachment, and confusion, the internal storms that cloud clarity and peace. Social obstacles, conflicts with family, loss of friendships, economic hardships, and societal pressures that isolate or restrict. Each obstacle is like a mirror reflecting not just past actions, but also the present quality of our mind and heart. They reveal areas where we may be caught in harmful habits or reactive tendencies. It's also important to recognize collective karma, the idea that groups, societies, or even nations can share karmic imprints. Historical injustices, environmental destruction, social unrest, these wider obstacles affect many lives at once, arising from shared actions and attitudes. Individual karma and collective karma often intertwine, creating complex patterns of challenge and opportunity. But here's the profound twist. Obstacles born of karma are not merely burdens to bear. They are potential gateways to awakening. Each difficulty holds the seed of insight if we learn to face it with mindfulness and courage. By recognizing obstacles as karmic expressions, we move beyond blaming or despair. Instead, we cultivate a deeper curiosity about what these challenges teach us, about impermanence, interdependence, and the nature of suffering itself. And this awareness opens the door to transformation. Because while karma brings obstacles, it also offers the path through them. A path marked by ethical living, meditation, wisdom, and compassion. As we move forward, we will explore how these karmic obstacles are not just trials, but opportunities, moments that test and refine our character, leading us closer to freedom. Understanding the types and effects of karma's obstacles helps us navigate life with greater clarity and resilience. The journey ahead invites us to embrace obstacles not as enemies, but as powerful teachers shaping the story of our spiritual growth. What if the very obstacles karma places in our path are not just problems to endure, but invitations to awaken, to transform, and to grow? This is one of Buddhism's most revolutionary insights. Karma's challenges are not dead ends or meaningless suffering. Instead, they are opportunities in disguise, beckoning us to look deeper, to learn, and to evolve. When life confronts us with hardship, whether it's loss, pain, conflict, or inner turmoil, our first instinct may be to resist, to blame, or to despair. But Buddhism invites us to pause and ask, what is this experience trying to teach me? Each obstacle is a mirror, reflecting parts of ourselves that remain hidden or unhealed. It exposes the attachments, fears, and illusions that keep us trapped in cycles of suffering. But beyond that, it offers a chance to cultivate qualities that bring true freedom, patience, compassion, insight, and resilience. Consider the metaphor of refining gold. The fire that seems destructive is actually necessary to purify the metal, removing impurities and revealing its true brilliance. Karma's obstacles work much the same way. Though they can be painful, they are the fire that refines the mind and spirit. This perspective transforms how we relate to difficulty. Instead of asking, "Why me?" we begin to ask, "How can I respond wisely? How can I grow through this?" Buddhist teachings provide concrete tools for this transformation. Mindfulness meditation trains us to observe our experience without judgment, allowing us to see obstacles clearly rather than being overwhelmed by them. Ethical precepts guide us to act with integrity, reducing the creation of new negative karma. Compassion for ourselves and others softens the heart, opening space for healing and connection. Awakening to karma as opportunity also means recognizing impermanence. No obstacle, no matter how daunting, lasts forever. Like clouds passing across the sky, challenges arise and then dissolve. This insight offers hope and courage to face life storms without losing our center. Moreover, the process of working with karma's obstacles deepens our understanding of interdependence, the truth that nothing exists in isolation. Our actions ripple outward, affecting others and the world. In embracing this, we cultivate responsibility and care, knowing that our growth benefits more than just ourselves. As we walk this path, obstacles become the very doorway to liberation. They teach us to let go of rigid control, to surrender to the flow of life, and to awaken to a profound freedom beyond suffering. In the chapters ahead, we will explore practical ways Buddhism guides us to transform obstacles through meditation, wisdom, and compassionate action, so that karma ceases to be a source of bondage and becomes the fertile ground for awakening. The journey is not easy, but it is rich with meaning and possibility. Each challenge holds a seed of awakening, waiting for us to discover and nurture it. When life's karmic obstacles weigh heavily on us, Buddhism offers a profound toolkit, a path of practices designed not only to endure hardship, but to transform it into wisdom and liberation. The first key is mindfulness, the simple yet revolutionary act of paying close, non-judgmental attention to our present experience. Through mindfulness meditation, we learn to observe our thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being swept away by them. This clarity creates space between stimulus and response, allowing us to break free from habitual reactions that often deepen suffering. Take, for example, the experience of anger triggered by a difficult situation. Without mindfulness, anger can spiral, fueling resentment and pain. But with mindful awareness, we see the anger arise, recognize it as a passing mental event, and choose how to respond. This moment of conscious choice is a powerful way to interrupt negative karmic cycles. Next comes ethical conduct, or sila, which serves as a foundation for transforming karma. By committing to non-harming, truthfulness, generosity, and kindness, we cultivate positive causes that bear wholesome fruit. These actions not only prevent the creation of new negative karma, but also gradually purify the seeds of past harmful actions. Compassion is another cornerstone. Buddhist practice invites us to extend kindness not only to others but also to ourselves. When facing obstacles, self-compassion softens the harsh inner critic and nurtures resilience. It helps us embrace our imperfections and failures as part of the shared human experience, reducing isolation and despair. Wisdom, or prajna, emerges as we deepen our understanding of impermanence, interdependence, and non-self. These insights dismantle the illusions that bind us, revealing the true nature of obstacles as transient and interconnected phenomena. Wisdom allows us to see suffering not as an enemy, but as a signal, a guide pointing the way toward liberation. Buddhist traditions also emphasize meditative visualization and mantra recitation as means to purify negative karma and cultivate positive energy. Practices such as Tonglen, the giving and taking meditation, train the heart to exchange self-centeredness for boundless compassion, transforming obstacles into opportunities for connection and healing. Another powerful method is generosity, or dana. By giving time, resources, or kindness without expectation, we weaken attachment and open the heart. Generosity reverses the constriction caused by karma's obstacles, inviting abundance and joy. Finally, the support of a spiritual community, or sangha, plays a crucial role. Sharing struggles with fellow practitioners creates a container of understanding and encouragement. Sangha reminds us we are not alone, and the collective energy of the group can uplift and inspire perseverance. All these practices weave together, creating a dynamic, ongoing process of transformation. Karma's obstacles remain present, but they no longer dominate or define us. Instead, they become catalysts for deep healing, insight, and freedom. In the next chapter, we will explore real-life stories and examples, vivid illustrations of how individuals have navigated karmic obstacles using these Buddhist tools, turning suffering into profound awakening. Imagine a life where the chains of karma no longer bind you, where obstacles arise but no longer imprison your mind or spirit. This is the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice: liberation from karma's binding power, a freedom that transcends the cycle of cause and effect. Karma, as we've seen, is not fate or punishment. It's a dynamic flow of intentional actions and their consequences. Yet this flow can seem like a relentless wheel, trapping beings in cycles of suffering, birth, death, and rebirth. The question then arises, can we truly break free? Buddhism answers with a resounding yes. The path to ultimate liberation, or nirvana, lies in uprooting the causes that generate karma itself, namely, ignorance, attachment, and aversion. These three poisons keep the wheel turning, driving us to act in ways that bind us ever tighter. When we cultivate wisdom to see reality clearly, understanding impermanence, non-self, and interdependence, ignorance begins to dissolve. Attachment loosens its grip, as we recognize the transient nature of all things. Aversion fades as compassion grows. This profound transformation weakens karma's grip until, finally, its power to create binding obstacles ceases. The mind is no longer caught in reactive patterns. It rests in a state of equanimity, peace, and boundless freedom. This freedom doesn't mean the end of challenges or life's ups and downs. Obstacles may still arise, but they no longer cause suffering or confusion. Like a seasoned sailor navigating storms with calm skill, the liberated mind remains steady amidst life's waves. Importantly, liberation from karma is not escapism. It is an active, engaged freedom, a deep participation in life without the compulsions of past conditioning. The liberated practitioner responds with wisdom and compassion, benefiting others while resting in inner peace. This ultimate freedom is available to all who walk the path sincerely. It's not reserved for mystics or monks alone. Through dedicated practice, ethical living, meditation, and wisdom, anyone can unravel the ties of karma and awaken. As we conclude this exploration, remember that karma's obstacles are both a challenge and an invitation, a profound call to awaken. The journey is long, sometimes arduous, but rich with meaning and hope. In our final chapter, we will reflect on how embracing this understanding shapes the way we live, love, and relate to the world, turning karma from a force of limitation into a path of awakening. As we come to the close of this journey through karma and its obstacles, it's essential to hold a final, transformative insight. Karma is not a prison, it is a path. Many people view karma as a heavy burden, an unchangeable fate that dooms us to repeat mistakes and suffer endlessly. But Buddhism teaches us something far more empowering. Karma is not a static sentence, but a dynamic process shaped by our awareness and choices. Each obstacle born from karma is not a trap to despair in, but a teacher inviting us to awaken. Every challenge is a moment to practice patience, compassion, and wisdom, qualities that gradually dissolve suffering and open the door to freedom. By embracing karma as a path, we shift from victimhood to agency. We recognize that while we cannot always control the circumstances we face, we can control how we respond. This response shapes our future, creating new patterns of kindness, insight, and liberation. Walking this path requires courage to face our shadows, to acknowledge mistakes without judgment, and to commit to growth even when the way is hard. But the reward is immeasurable. A life lived with clarity, purpose, and profound peace. Remember, too, that this path is not solitary. The Buddha's teachings and the community of practitioners offer guidance, support, and inspiration. Together, we cultivate a fertile ground where karma's obstacles can transform into stepping stones for awakening. In embracing karma's lessons, we discover that freedom is not about escaping life's challenges, but about meeting them fully, with open heart and clear mind. It is about turning the wheel of cause and effect into a spiral of awakening, ever rising toward greater wisdom and compassion. So, as you continue your journey, carry this truth with you. Obstacles are not the end of the road. They are the road itself, the unfolding path to liberation, waiting to be walked with courage and love. Thank you for exploring this profound teaching with me. May your understanding deepen, your compassion expand, and your journey toward freedom flourish.